Welcome, everyone, to our second webinar of 2026 on cannabis in the workplace. Today is April 20th, and we're glad to have you here to talk about cannabis and impairment, and a topic that we think employers and employees need to know about. This is the HealthLinks webinar series, and we're glad to have you join us today. For those of you that are familiar with our process, please drop into the chat where you're joining us from. It's great to see names and where everybody's coming in from on this webinar. And my name is David Shapiro, and I run this HealthLinks webinar series. I am a white man in my late 40s, and I work at the Colorado School of Public Health for the Centers for Health, Work, and Environment, oversee day-to-day operations of a program called HealthLinks. It's great to be participating in this webinar, to be having this conversation on April 20th. And I am a person in recovery from cannabis use disorder. So over the course of my life, 420 and April 20th has held a lot of different meanings. And one of the things I really appreciate about being in recovery is I get to have conversations with scientists and researchers like you're about to hear from about the impact of cannabis without any judgment or stigma attached to it, just how it affects us as individuals and how it affects us as workers. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All participants are on mute today, so please use the chat bar not only to tell us where you're from, thank you so much for telling us where you're joining in from, but also for any technical assistance you might need. We will be using the Q&A function on Zoom, on the Zoom toolbar for any questions you have for speakers, so be thinking about your questions and moving them over to the Q&A section for any of our speakers today. We'll have some time at the end of the session for a discussion with questions. Closed captions are available. If you need that, please use that on your Zoom toolbar. And if you need continuing education credits, CEUs, we will be sending that in a survey as follow-up. So I just want to note here, folks, there's not going to be a pop-up that automatically comes up when you leave today's webinar. You will get the link to claim your continuing education credits in a follow-up email. And this webinar is being recorded, so if you want to share it with colleagues, if you want to come back to it later on, we'll have the recording available for you. HealthLinks is a public health outreach program. We put occupational health, workplace health and safety into practice by building champions who are health and safety experts in their workplace, and also assessing using the Healthy Workplace Assessment to focus on total worker health in the workplace and to consult and advise companies on the total worker health approach. We are located, our Centers for Health, Work, and Environment, at the Colorado School of Public Health, which is at the University of Colorado on the Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora, Colorado. We are one of 10 centers of excellence for total worker health, funded by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, and NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. We always start with a land acknowledgement, and I will read that here. It's also on your screen. As we gather, we honor and acknowledge that the University of Colorado's 4 campuses are on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone nations. Further, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribal nations historically tied to the lands that comprise what is now called Colorado. Acknowledging that we live in the homelands of indigenous peoples recognizes the original stewards of these lands and their legacies. And with this land acknowledgement, we celebrate the many contributions of Native peoples to the fields of medicine, mathematics, government and military service, arts, literature, engineering, and more. We also recognize the sophisticated and intricate knowledge systems indigenous peoples have developed in relationship to their lands. We recognize and affirm the ties these nations have to their traditional homelands and the many indigenous people who thrive in this place alive and strong. We also acknowledge the painful history of ill treatment and forced removal that has had a profoundly negative impact on Native nations. We respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this place. We honor them and thank the indigenous ancestors of this place. The University of Colorado pledges to provide educational opportunities for Native students, faculty, and staff, and advance our mission to understand the history and contemporary lives of Native peoples. I also want to mention that the views expressed today are those of our speakers. They do happen to work at the Colorado School of Public Health, but they do not intently express the views of the Centers for Health, Work, and Environment or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And we encourage you to attend this event in whatever way, shape, or form makes most sense to you. We are going to be talking a little bit about the impact of cannabis on impairment and on workers in general. We're going to be talking a little bit about policies and practices in the workplace. And so if you need to get up, if you need to walk around, if you need to engage with the content in whatever way, please do so in what's most comfortable for you. We'll have a keynote presentations today, followed by a panel discussion or a discussion with a few speakers, and then a question and answer where you'll be able to come off of we'll be able to put your Q&A your question in the Q&A section, and we'll moderate those questions as we have time. Our hope is that we can have you better understand what is high potency cannabis. And here's a quick tip. It's pretty much everything these days, and explain how it differs from traditional products. Also, we want you to better understand the public health impacts of cannabis use, especially for young adults and people who are of working age. And then think a little bit about the correlation or the relationship between cannabis use and workplace health and safety. We will focus on some higher risk sectors like construction, restaurant, hospitality. With that, I'm going to introduce our dean, a distinguished speaker today, Dean Dr. Kathy Bradley. Dr. Kathy Bradley is the dean of the Colorado School of Public Health and deputy director of the University of Colorado's Cancer Center. She is a health economist whose research focuses on work, health insurance, cancer, and reducing financial hardship and health disparities. Dr. Bradley, thanks so much for being here today. It's lovely to have you, and I'll let you kick us off with a little bit of information about how the school is approaching cannabis.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. It's such a pleasure to be here today. The Colorado School of Public Health is among the top 15 schools of public health in the country, and it's the only one in the state of Colorado in the Rocky Mountain region. In 2021, the Colorado General Assembly charged the Colorado School of Public Health with examining the human health effects of today's cannabis products and sharing evidence-based findings with the public. And since then, I've been incredibly proud of the robust research that's been developed by our entire team at the school and the campus, ranging from reviewing more than 700 studies on the topic to generating our own research to inform the national dialogue on this topic. Then in 2024, we launched the public awareness campaign, the T on THC, that has already reached thousands of Coloradans and even people beyond the state on critical research that we've generated. And in a few moments, you'll hear from Drs. Tung and Collier, two Colorado School of Public Health faculty leaders who provide deep insight into what we've learned and offer alternative coping strategies for cannabis use impacting many workplaces across Colorado. I want you all to know that our work is generated in rigorous science, and it's shaped by the lived experiences of Colorado communities, urban, rural, and mountain regions. And through strong internal and campus partnership, we're able to tailor the education outreach for unique audiences statewide. And this project reinforces our responsibility to show up for all communities in Colorado and ensure they have clear, accessible, and actionable information. And we invite you to use those resources, share them within your networks, and tell us how we can continue to support your communities. We're committed to translating complex research into practical tools for individuals, for families, employers, and also policymakers. So thank you all who are here today and for advancing the field of public health in this important work.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bradley. It's really an honor and a privilege to have you here. And I'm so grateful to work at the Colorado School of Public Health, where we get to do some of this research on how cannabis is impacting population health and specifically workplace. With that, I'm going to introduce Dr. Greg Tung. Dr. Greg Tung is an associate professor at the Colorado School of Public Health, and his research focuses on injury and violence prevention, including youth violence, suicide, poisoning, and child abuse, as well as how research is used in policy and program decisions. Dr. Tung, it's great to have you here today. I'll kick things over to you.
All right, David, thanks for the intro. And I'm going to talk just for a little bit with a focus on, what is the deal? What is the deal with cannabis products today, or what do you really need to know about today's THC products? And I'll just give you the quick summary right from the start. What cannabis is, weed, marijuana, THC, whatever you want to call it, it's really fundamentally changed with increasing legalization and liberalization in the United States. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just to start off with the basics here, when we talk about cannabis, marijuana, weed, we really, I'm going to focus on kind of two primary ingredients. The first being THC is what we traditionally think about as the primary, both psychoactive and intoxicating agent in cannabis. So, just to use plain terminology, it's the It's the ingredient that gets people high when they smoke weed or use a THC or cannabis-based product. And I think the other major component that people think of when we talk about cannabis is CBD. And that's also psychoactive, but non-intoxicating, tends to be associated with some of the medicinal or therapeutic uses of cannabis overall. And one of the things that's happened through time and with innovations in cannabis products in the current marketplace is that the shift has really moved towards THC. If you go into a dispensary in Colorado or in other states that have legal and regulated markets, what you're typically going to see is a very THC dominated kind of products that are available. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. That's been very intentional in terms of um, the growth of the plant, the focus of the plant, and also product development from the cannabis industry. Next slide, please. So not that long ago, when people thought about cannabis, people traditionally thought of flower, right? So that would be a cannabis flower, cannabis bud, a joint related types of products. And now with innovations in the current marketplace, we're increasingly seeing greater diversity of other types of products. So flower is still typically the predominant product that's available, but we're also seeing concentrates in all different kinds of forms that show up in vape pens and also the basic concentrated format. We're seeing edibles. You know, decades ago, edibles were sometimes a cookie, sometimes a brownie that you'd see, and now the diversification of edibles and gummies and drinks and all these different things that are cannabis and THC infused is just the diversity is really incredible. And the final category we have on here is tinctures. And again, the entire marketplace is really shifting away from flower and shifting more towards these other kinds of products. Next slide, please. And I'll get a little bit more into the numbers, or maybe the previous slide highlighted some of these, but when we're talking about the marketplace overall, the concentration of THC is really gone up. And the concentrated product class is really the area where THC concentrations are just really incredibly high and just look totally different than what people think of as marijuana, cannabis, or weed from decades ago. And just this slide illustrates some of those examples: shatter, waxes, sugars, butters, distillates. These are chemically concentrated forms of THC that have THC concentrations 70, 80, 90 plus percent. Next slide, please. And this slide just illustrates in the Colorado marketplace, which I think is somewhat representative of the markets in the United States overall, what the shift has been recently. So here on the left side, you see in 2015, the marketplace was really predominantly flower, but also edibles, concentrates, and other kinds of things. And as we move forward here into 2025, or just recently last year, yes, flower is still the predominant product, but what we're seeing is especially concentrates. The highest concentration forms of cannabis are playing a bigger role and getting a bigger slice of the marketplace. And here is another graph from Colorado. And what this just does is shows the distribution of THC concentration in both flower on the left and concentrates on the right. And so what you see is, the flower product is not what it was from decades ago when the THC concentrations were 3, 4, 5%. And now we're in a situation where the average THC concentration in Colorado and many other places throughout the United States is about 20%. And you can see that distribution taking it right up to 30. Just have a little bit of a side note that my understanding is like the biological limitation of the plant is around a 30% THC concentration. But all of that changes when you start chemically concentrating things. And the graph over on the right shows the distribution of THC concentration for concentrated products. That average is around 72%. But as you can see, products get into the 80 plus, 90 plus THC percent concentration. And I'll just say the big question with the change in the marketplace, the increasing concentration is, well, what are the implications of that? Are there increasing effects and increasing harms? And I'll just start off with this screen grab from a couple of different publications here. One is the Denver Post, one is the New York Times. And what was happening is with these changes in the marketplace, people started observing really negative outcomes. And asking themselves that question, what's really driving that? Is it increasing availability? Is it increasing concentration? The short answer is it's all of the above, but certainly concentration is also playing a role. Next slide, please. So in the intro, Dean Bradley did a nice job talking about the work here at the Colorado School of Public Health that's done in collaboration with the Colorado State Legislature. I'll just emphasize again that the foundation for all of our work is research. And this is our kind of research shock and awe slide. So I'll just emphasize again that our team here, all the information that we're putting forward to you, and all of the research foundation for the T on THC comes from rigorous scientific review. And this is just a diagram or a Prisma diagram showing some of our review activities. I'll just give you the bottom line is here at the Colorado School of Public Health, we're now the leading academic entity on the research related to high concentration cannabis. And I'll boil it down to the really kind of basic fundamental questions of how big of a deal is concentration? Does concentration matter? And does concentration contribute to greater effects? And when we're talking about harms, greater harms, and the bottom line answer to that is yes, that concentration does matter and it does contribute to harms. Next slide, please. And maybe I'll just draw your attention for those of you that might enjoy reading academic papers. Here's one that we did recently. And the title is High Concentration THC Cannabis Products and Mental Health Outcomes. Next slide, I'll get right to the bottom line. And in this review paper, we look at the body of scientific literature and what that really communicates. And the bottom line here is that high concentration THC products, we did find them to be associated with unfavorable mental health outcomes, particularly for psychosis, schizophrenia, and cannabis use disorder. And so does concentration matter? It absolutely does. Is concentration independent of all these other factors associated with harms? It is. The full spectrum of those harms, research we're still trying to figure out, but I would say the area where those harms are probably the best documented in the literature is mental health harms. And again, I'll emphasize our own review highlighting psychosis, schizophrenia, and cannabis use disorder. Next slide, please. Okay, I think I'm about to turn it over back to you, David. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Dr. Tung, for setting the stage here today with us. Clearly, the products have changed in the last 20 years, and with legalization as well. It's important for us to know what some of these things are, and more people I talk to don't actually understand the full range of products. So thank you so much for that background. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Annie Collier. Dr. Annie Collier is a clinical psychologist and researcher whose work focuses on behavioral health, well-being, and community-based public health programs. She specializes in mental health, substance use, digital health, and working with Indigenous and under-resourced communities. Dr. Collier, thanks so much for being here with us today to describe more about the behavioral health impacts we're seeing.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm going to give you just a brief overview. My role on the project is translating all of the information that we have in the background science and working closely with a company called Initium Health, where we have developed a public health campaign that translates that information into bites and sound bites and things that the public can digest. We have a lot of that information available for you on the website, and we can also provide other information as you need it. Before we go to the next slide, I just really want to emphasize something that Greg said and Kathy said, which is that we spent a lot of time talking to communities to find out how we should present the information and what kind of information they wanted to know. So, for example, coming up with alternative ways of coping, one of the biggest messages was, don't just tell us what not to do, tell us what we can do instead. So we've really tried to get away from the DARE campaign approach, which is, don't use this, just say no. Okay, next slide. So one of the key things is about who uses cannabis is that it is used predominantly by people under 25 years of age. And it's higher in Colorado than it is in the general US, 46% in Colorado use and 36% across the US. And if you look at the daily use, we also see that it's like instead of just have you ever used, 10% across the US, but 30% in Colorado, and that has somewhat to do with the legality and availability of it. But our campaign has then gone to really focusing on people who are younger. And even though we say 25 years of age, it's really important to know that the age of brain development can be different for different people. And 25 is used as an average, but we really are trying to attract that audience. Okay, next slide. And so there's some really difficult problems. Greg mentioned some of them. Short term, you see difficulties with learning, memory, concentration, so generally in thinking. And you also see changes in people dizziness, paranoia, panic, and it can also worsen underlying mental health conditions like anxiety or depression. And in the long run, you do see, as Greg mentioned, we do have now evidence to show that people can develop cannabis use disorder, which is basically an addiction to cannabis. And we also see a much higher risk for psychosis, schizophrenia, so severe mood disorders. Unfortunately, and you see this on the third point here, is that the long-term impacts on thinking may continue, especially if you started younger. So that is also a concern why we want to get that information out to people. And then you see breathing problems similar to if you've been smoking and smoking started at an earlier age. Next slide. We also, as part of the young, working on trying to get information out to people who are younger, cannabis has a really potentially severe impact on women when they're pregnant and the fetus development. So we also see that 19% of women who use cannabis before pregnancy, 8% continue during pregnancy, highest uses in the first trimester, and THC can transfer to the developing fetus, and it can transfer to the baby through breast milk because it is basically collects in the fatty tissue. So at this point, the American Academy for Gynecology, Obstetrics and Gynecology recommend that there's no known safe dose for pregnant and nursing individuals. And so therefore, why are people using it? We think it's predominantly a lack of education about its effects during pregnancy. And that's both in providers and in people who are pregnant. So in general, people think that it's a safe alternative, let's say if you've got nausea and vomiting, which is why it would be used in the first trimester. But people are not as familiar with what that is. Next slide. So the types of issues we see, short term is balance, increased risk of falls and injury, because as you probably can imagine, when somebody is using cannabis, they may not be as physically stable, dizziness, paranoia, panic. And we do see that it can worsen underlying mental health conditions and worsen lung conditions. Now, we also see that in women who've been using cannabis, we see changes in the baby. We'll have low birth weight, preterm, higher incidence of stillbirth, increased use of NICU admissions. And then at all developmental stages, we see potential problems that have been documented by cannabis use. And one thing that Greg may have mentioned, but not emphasized as much, is that a lot of the research has been done on the ordinary cannabis, the cannabis that was 3 to 5%, because its FDA did not approve access to this kind of heavier dose, which is in the marketplace. That's beginning to change. So all of this information that you see on this slide in terms of the impact on developing children, not just the fetus, is most of it is in lower doses. So that's another reason why it's not suggested that the mother use cannabis during development. Okay, next slide. What might you notice if you have somebody in the workplace who's using cannabis? Well, you might notice changes in behavior like lethargy, inability to focus, diminished performance at work. And 30% of the people who actually use cannabis have a problem with it. So using it may be associated with a higher difficulty in the workforce. You will probably see paraphernalia like vape pens, cartridges, dab pens. I mean, red eyes of frequent use, but it does say here a strong smell of weed or a new scent to cover it up. It's really important to know that many of the products today, especially the higher concentrate products, do not have any smell associated with it. So you might not be able to see that somebody's using it. You also could see poor, slow hand-eye coordination. Next slide. I don't want to go into this in depth, but what is really concerning, particularly with younger people, is that there's a higher incidence of developing psychotic symptoms. And hallucinations are when you see something, hear something that's not there. Delusions are when you have a belief about something that's not grounded in reality. And then disordered thinking would be you lose your train of thought, you have a hard time thinking clearly. And what we know is that people, even though the incidence of developing psychotic disorders in cannabis is low, if you have a psychotic reaction to cannabis, you are 50% more likely to develop schizophrenia or bipolar disorder later in life. So the odds are low, but if you have it, you are more likely going to have severe mental health problems. And there's more and more research that suggests that with the higher potency products on the market today, there's a greater likelihood of that developing. And use at an earlier age is going to be associated with that as well. So it's really concerning to think about developing brain and the impact of cannabis, particularly these high concentration products. So the positive side, what have we been doing in addition to educate people about this kind of information? We have really emphasized trying to help people think about alternative ways to cope. From some research we've been doing, we have found that people who are using cannabis are actually less familiar with alternative ways of coping. And there could be many reasons for that. I don't have time to go into that. But we really try to emphasize some of the key types of coping, and I'm not covering everything. I mean, there's so many different things that you could think about that could help, but we really try to emphasize positive coping and encourage people to think about using more positive ways of coping, because that could really help people manage stress, anxiety, and mood and calm instead of relying on cannabis. Next slide. Additional things we're doing with the campaign is we heard repeatedly from community members, how do I talk to somebody? How do I talk to my kid? How do I talk to my kids in school, people I work with? It's really anxiety provoking, and it's really concerning, especially if they have used cannabis in the past or they're current users, but they may be concerned about youth using it. So we have developed curriculum that is integrated into the campaign and is available that helps people talk about it. Another thing we've been doing is developing materials for providers to educate them. As I said, a lot of providers don't even know themselves how dangerous it could be. Then we have other innovative things we've been doing, like use of art as an alternative to just having like public health information. Cannabis does this to your brain. We have been repeatedly using art exhibitions as a way to promote conversations in the community and try to present that information in more innovative ways. I think that's my last slide. Yes, I'm gonna stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Collier. We really appreciate the additional information. And it's great to see all of the questions coming in on the chat. Please keep those up. We're going to start to respond to some of them directly with T on THC information from the campaign, because we're not going to be able to get to all of them during our Q&A session. With that, I'm going to introduce our fourth and final speaker today, Kristen White. Thank you, Kristen, for being here. Kristen is a partner in the Denver office of her firm, Fisher Phillips, and co-chairs its workplace safety and catastrophe management practice group. She advises employers on workplace safety, injury-related leave issues, and employment law matters, and represents clients before government agencies and administrative boards. Kristen has been a strong advocate in our Recovery Friendly Workplace initiative for many years, and we're really grateful to have you here with us today, Kristen. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, David. I appreciate it. So it was so interesting listening to the speakers talk about, the use of cannabis and the strength of it and the potency. So what I was coming at this from the employer angle was, where does that leave employers today? Because I liked the comment of we're not just doing the dare, don't do it anymore, right? And I think for employers, we've really got to get to this word here that I use a lot. I'm going to use a lot today, impairment. And so I hear from a lot of clients, and I work with a lot in the hospitality space, in the construction space, which is, Kristen, we're just not all that concerned about if someone has drugs in their system. We want to know if they're impaired on the work, at the work site and at the workplace. And, but there's a lot of challenges there, because right now, and this last bullet to me is, there's really limited methods to try to assess impairment. We don't have, testing for cannabis like we do for alcohol. We know that DOT and, some of the federal regulators are trying to put out this limit, this 5 nanograms of THC. Does that show acute impairment? We know there's a lot of research going on in Canada around this issue, but it's really hard to get to the issue of impairment, I think, for employers because, long-term use is an issue. So is this someone who, they weigh 250, they use it a lot, their levels are going to look a lot different than someone, who maybe weighs 100 pounds and doesn't use it very often. So there's just a lot of concerns around impairment. And how do we evaluate that as employers? So we can go to the next slide, David. So one of the things we tried to put together is, what are your considerations and best practices then as an employer when you're trying to get to impairment mindset? And you're thinking about, are we going to accommodate medical users in the workplace? And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. What does that look like? We like fitness for duty exams, when people have been off work, not, because that also helps us determine if they're physically able to do the job. We've got to consider CBD products. I thought it was really interesting, Dr. Tong's presentation here about showing, there's a difference between THC and CBD, but we know that CBD, depending on levels, can cause positive tests. How are we going to handle that in the workplace? And what does that mean for an employer? Part of this is there's not one size fits all in this space. And that's why we talk about you as a company have to decide what's going to be our system to identify and try to assess impaired individuals. We have some employers that are relying on reasonable suspicion testing, or they're training their frontline people, especially in construction or hospitality, to be able to try to identify, am I seeing something? Am I hearing it? Although, as Dr. Collier was just saying, the smells have changed, right? I mean, I gotta be honest, I wasn't even aware of that you can now have it with a different smell. So that could become even more complicated now that, are the smells going to be different? Are we looking for eyes, but maybe that change in behavior? Are we going to rely on that? If we are, we really need to train our supervisors and train our people to do that. We have some employers that have gone to this testing option. So there's companies that have put out on the market, they call them games. They don't call them tests that the employee takes for about 30 seconds or a minute right before they start work, because that doesn't just get to drug impairment. That gets to any kind of impairment. Maybe I didn't sleep last night because my child was sick, or maybe I'm going through a bad divorce and I haven't slept in a couple days. So there's, a lot of employers have broadened this impairment discussion even beyond drugs, that look, we just want to know if our employees are fit for duty or if they're impaired for any reason. So there are some things on the market to try to assess that. Simulators, not always practical for every environment, but that is something that we're seeing as well. And then really defining your safety sensitive positions. And we'll talk about this when we get into some state law issues, that may become even more important when you get to an accommodation discussion. Do you have good job descriptions, and have you defined your safety sensitive positions so that you can start thinking about, are there positions we're going to accommodate, medical card users? Are there ones that we can't? What is that line? It's usually a safety sensitive, but we've got to have written job descriptions. We've got to have defined those positions. So this is a map I like to use many times because I think it, honestly, is one of those that's a little shocking to, depending on where you live in the country, when you start to see where we're at now. And I'll tell you, as doing various iterations of this presentation over the years for different safety audiences, we update this map probably every 6 months at least. Definitely every time before we present it, because it changes every time. And it's been interesting to me when watching the states that used to just have nothing, and now they'll have this low THC or CBD products. Like, for example, Oklahoma was that. Now Oklahoma is a medical marijuana state. Kansas now has moved to low CBD. Will medical marijuana be next? That's usually the transition. You kind of see Idaho out there as our outlier with having no legal use. But I think this is very eye-opening for a lot of employers, because that's why we have to talk about impairment and not just don't use it, right? Because you need to hire employees. You want to hire people. You want to talk about impairment. We can go to the next slide, Dave. So accommodation, we go to the next one. This is what I think really comes up for employers the most. So just to level set us, where does accommodation come from for employers? It starts with your ADA, which is a federal law. Many states have adopted their own version, but we start with from the federal perspective that under the ADA, you can prohibit drug and alcohol use in the workplace. So you can have a zero tolerance. I mean, from a legal perspective, I always like employers to know you can have a zero tolerance policy. You can offer post-offer pre-employment medical exams. During employment, medical exams have to be job related and consistent with business necessity. Now, I want to contrast that against a reasonable suspicion drug test. A reasonable suspicion drug test isn't typically considered a medical exam. And I give a little qualifier there because sometimes our states get complicated. But a reasonable suspicion drug test, the reasonable suspicion is what's giving you the basis to do that drug test, making you have that in your policy. So a little different than a medical exam here. One thing I want to point out is that if an employee needs to take a leave of absence for rehabilitation program, or say they need to leave to do meetings during the week, that can be a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. Now, the important part is that is before a violation has occurred. Excuse me. So before this person has been impaired at work and they've been found to be impaired. If they come to you, they're in recovery, they are in a protected class. So keep that in mind when we're thinking about reasonable accommodation. We can go to the next slide. So one of the things I like to kind of end on here is, accommodating medical marijuana. We hear, well, I have a prescription. So I want to level set us a little bit because this is where it gets complicated. And I know, and looking at the chat, people are all over the country here. So this is where knowing your state law becomes very important. So from a federal perspective, let's start there. Federal law, you're not required to accommodate an employee using medical marijuana. That's not the discussion though. So and little side note there, if marijuana would be moved from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, our accommodation discussion may look different from the federal perspective. That would be, if that would occur, defining your safety sensitive positions is going to become even more important because that's what's going to keep that trigger on your federal side. But let's talk about kind of where our states are here. So here in Colorado, we have very clear Supreme Court decision that employers are not required to accommodate, not even just an employee's need to use medical marijuana, but just having it in your system. And that's been our law here, but that's not true across all states. We have states that have been passing what's called kind of anti-discrimination or fair employment laws that prohibit discrimination against medical card holders. So what does that mean? That typically means that an employer is prohibited from firing or not hiring someone solely because they have a medical marijuana card. And in some cases, excuse me, and in some cases, that can be if the employee tests positive for THC. If they're not in a safety sensitive position, what else do we have besides that positive test? Do we have some type of impairment or reasonable suspicion, something that we have looked at? And it's interesting where these laws have grown up that are becoming a little more protective of medical card holders. States such as Arizona, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, West Virginia. If we're thinking election, blue versus red, it's not just your blue states. California and Washington have recently enacted some protections for off-duty use as well. But it's interesting that it's not just your blue states here. There are some states where case law has developed protections. So think Northeast, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont, where you're having you're having decisions coming from courts where they're asking employers, you need to engage in some kind of interactive process before just terminating this person if they've told you they have a medical reason and a card. Again, safety sensitive becomes very important. So I wanted to point out some of the interesting things we have here with states. Oh, one point here. One of the other states I wanted to mention is that in Nevada, they're looking at that you've got to provide reasonable accommodation unless there's a safety risk. I thought that was an interesting development there in Nevada. So it's one of the things to keep in mind is you've got to know your state specific law. And many of you, if you operate and you work in companies that are in multiple states, can be a complicated analysis for you. So that's where I think, we start again from that impairment mindset. We don't have to accommodate use on the job. We don't have to accommodate impairment. Then we look at what are our safety sensitive roles? How are we going to define those so we know if we want to have an accommodation discussion with an employee who has a medical card, what positions is that potentially open for? And what have we done in the past? Let's be consistent across job positions, but how do we have that conversation and what can we do? Do we have federal contracts? Again, that throws in another wrench of what you can do because that federal law is likely going to trump your state law. So this is an area that is complicated. As an employment lawyer, this is what we do. We help clients try to work through this and navigate it, working all across the country. But it is something to stay, up on your state law and how that's developing and how that's changing. And I'm happy to, take questions, Dave. We can go to the next slide. I'm happy to take some questions and, different things that people may have they want to talk about. Because like I said, this is such an evolving area of law and it gets complicated when you get into all these different states.
Thanks so much, Kristen. I'm going to ask Dr. Tong and Dr. Collier to also come back onto video as we think about the Q&A. And there's so many great questions in Q&A right now. I really appreciate the dialogue. We probably do not have time for all of them. I'm going to wait to ask the big one for just a moment and start with there's some conversation in the chat about the reclassification and the rescheduling of cannabis at the federal level. And I'd love to hear a little bit from public health research and also from law, the legal community, about what we're thinking about, what that might mean for us as public health practitioners from the legal profession. Maybe, Kristen, I'll start with you and your team. Are you paying attention to the reclassification efforts around cannabis, and have you forecast what that might mean, or have you started to have conversations with employers about things they should be thinking about?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think we've just been watching, is it going to be reclassified and what that movement looks like? I think it'll be interesting to hear from those at the School of Public Health if they have more of maybe the background of what those discussions are. We just are watching, is it happening? But you're right, talking to employers about if that would occur, there could be some federally recognized medical use. And so we run much more into an accommodation discussion, making that safety sensitive discussion even more important.
Got it. That makes sense. Greg, any thoughts, or Annie? Maybe I'll start with you, Greg, on the reclassification, the descheduling, rescheduling efforts.
Yeah, sure. And I'll just remind everybody that despite the broad kind of liberalization and legalization and in Colorado and other states, cannabis is still currently a Schedule I substance at the federal level. And the definition of that is that, high abuse potential with no medical uses or no therapeutic benefits. I'll just say, and the current discussion is around reclassification to Schedule III, which does recognize the potential use for therapeutic and medical applications. I mean, cannabis is in a really interesting situation where, despite that Schedule I classification, we've have broad liberalization and legalization at the state level, and that's led to an interesting dynamic where it's very available. So I'm here in Denver, Colorado. I can walk out onto one of our major thoroughfares here, Colfax Avenue, and I can't go a block without walking into a dispensary. And the array of products are really just incredibly available. But because of the Schedule I designation, there are very serious research restrictions in place. And I won't go into all of those details, but basically because it's got this definition or it's in this classification where there's no therapeutic uses, the opportunities to do research are very limited. So the bottom line there is what we have is this interesting situation where it's technically illegal at the federal level. I'm getting into the legal space, so I'll move on from there quickly. It's technically illegal at the federal level, but there's this broad liberalization and legalization at the state level, and we're very much in the situation where research really hasn't kept up with market innovations, demands, and growth. both in the therapeutic applications and medical uses, and on the harms as well. That research is happening, but it doesn't benefit fully from NIH and other federal funding sources because there are restrictions because of that Schedule 1. So I think that movement, which is, I'll be frank, maybe this is more of an opinion of Greg, random guy off the street, is it seems inevitable that reclassification is going to happen. Effectively, we're operating like cannabis is a Schedule 3 substance already in the majority of states, and I think all indications is that's just going to continue. And as we move forward, I think maybe one of the upsides of that reclassification is that's going to open up the opportunity for more research to happen. But I'll just say the industry has a huge head start here in terms of their growth and maturity, product development, all those. It's gonna be really hard to catch up. Maybe I'm talking too much, so I'll bite my tongue there.
Thank you, Dr. Tung. Dr. Collier, did you have anything you want to add to that? Or okay, great.
No, I think it's fine.
Thank you so much. First of all, you're not a random guy off the street based on your knowledge and subject matter expertise, but I appreciate you classifying yourself that way. I'm going to lump a couple questions together again before we get to the big one, and I'm going to start, Dr. Collier, with you. And I think the question, as I frame a few together, there's a question about, is there any recommendations for how to use cannabis safely? Is there, and then, it's kind of described as medicinal quite a bit, right? And also, is there certain dosages that people are more prone to experience some of the very negative or some of the very severe consequences that you describe? Like, is it a tolerance level? And so, like, in your mind and from your perspective, and when we're talking with youth or young adults or someone who's never used before, is there, right now, what are your thoughts about, is there an opportunity to use cannabis safely as a question, or when might some of these more serious consequences happen? The psychosis and some of the other things you talked about. Is there any way to predict any of that for people?
Well, it's a really good question, and it puts me in the campaign is really, it's kind of a rocky approach, because we have heard from the community that people want to know how to use it safely, how to use harm reduction, what they can do to decrease the impact. And we've really stayed away from it because a big percentage of the people who are using it are under 21. And so legally, they really shouldn't be using it. And so it puts us in a conundrum of advising people how to use it safely when they shouldn't be using it, which I think at some point our campaign is going to go in that direction. And we already have a looser way of dealing with it, people who are pregnant, because more people who are pregnant are over the age of 21. I think in general, where we've come to, and we've had this discussion for the 2.5 years I've been involved with this project, is what dose is safe and how much is safe. And it really comes down to the research can't answer that question, but there's enough indication that earlier use is associated with more harms, and using it more consistently is associated with more harms. So basically, we think there probably is a dose relationship to frequent use, and higher concentration use will be associated with more harms, but we don't have enough evidence to say specifically this will happen at this percentage or at this dose. So we basically have made that one of our messages is caution that more persistent, consistent use at an earlier age is worse. So we really try to encourage people and parents in terms of how they talk to their kids to just try to have them it's not terrible, and we're not saying it's bad for everybody, but when your brain is still developing, you're going to have more harms. In my own kids, that was really my message. I have kids who are now 26 and 25, and that was really the message was, can you just try not to use it very much, wait till you're older, even though it's legally okay, because there are going to be potentially more trouble. And you have something else, and then I'll see if Greg, whatever you want to add to this, there's something else that's going on, which is that the odds of having a psychotic disorder, particularly schizophrenia, tend to happen in that 17 to 25-year-old age group. And so that alone means you're going to be more likely to have that. And there is an indication that cannabis use can increase the odds of that happening, especially if you have that psychotic reaction. So brains are more fragile, delay onset, be aware that more frequent use and concentrations are going to be associated with problems. Greg, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll just riff off of everything that you said here, and just highlight that it it's complicated. There's complicated dynamics that are at play here. Because are there legitimate medical and therapeutic uses of cannabis? I think the research all points to yes, absolutely. And so if you're in that group of individuals that has a compelling medical justification, I think that balance and that conversation looks totally different. Are there legitimate recreational uses? Well, the voters in Colorado and increasingly the voters in other states are saying yes to that particular question. And are there very real harms? Yes. Do those harms become more likely with higher concentration, earlier onset, more frequent use? Yes to all of that. So going back to what Annie touched on, if you look at our campaign, our priority populations are youth and pregnant individuals. And I think without a compelling medical justification, the best advice on safe use is no use. And then I think a broader message needs to go out to everybody else, which is this is not a harmless product. There are harms, and concentration matters. And with higher concentration, those harms are greater.
Greg, I just want to pause on what you said because it was a pretty impactful statement. You said related to pregnant individuals and maybe other individuals at high risk and or uh, the safest use is no use.
Yeah,
Did I hear that correctly? Is
that
that
is correct.
yeah,
And
right.
I think that's very much a focus on our campaign. We put a lot of thought into this particular component. If you're a youth, young adult person, or you're pregnant and you do not have a compelling medical justification, the
Mm.
safest use is no use. The recommendation is no use.
Thanks, Greg. I appreciate you slowing down on that. I think it's a really important segue into the question that has the most votes. And I'm going to start with you, Kristen, because my interpretation of the conversations we've had is it's about impairment in the workplace. And if
Mhm.
someone is impaired and unable to do their job, that could happen from one-time use, that could happen from prolonged use, it could happen from someone that's been a user and has a product interacting with something differently, all these factors that you said. So the question is about how do we deal with the relationship between um, prevention focused, recovery supportive workplace strategies? So we want to get people help and support when a workplace is more zero tolerant or has less tolerance around impairment due to psychoactive substances. You and I have had this conversation so many
Mhm.
times about drug screening and drug testing and how companies have it, but our listeners haven't been privy to those conversations. So,
Mhm.
in your mind, how does like a thoughtful employer approach getting workers the help they need around something in addition to keeping the workplace safe? And I don't know if that's necessarily prevention as much as it is getting people resources. We've always advocated for,
Mhm.
does it really need to be a zero tolerance policy, or can you expand it a little bit more, which most companies do in practice? And so I'm giving you some feeders for this question because it's kind of the reason we do some of this work.
Mhm.
But what are your thoughts about this dichotomy between public health efforts like T on THC and the work you do with companies in terms of keeping people safe? Where's the bridge in your mind?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, David. And I think we've talked about it a lot because it can be a hard issue, as far as where to draw that line. But, I think is having written drug testing policies. I do think employers, you have to decide what kind of drug testing are we going to do? I like all employers to have at least reasonable suspicion in accident and post-accident. I mean, even if we're not going to do pre-employment, those two, because I think that helps us, as you're saying, find out, yeah, if someone's impaired, what happened here. But I've got a lot of employers that'll do what's called a last chance agreement. So even if like you're saying, maybe we have either a zero tolerance or close to a zero tolerance, and someone tests positive for whatever reason, and you want to get them help, and they're saying, what, I was in recovery, or I've fallen back, and you're thinking, okay, let's get you in a rehabilitation program. A lot of employers will have EAP, different things we can do. There's a lot of ways to provide that time off, even for small employers. Through, like in Colorado, we now have family, it's not just federal FMLA. So there's ways they can do that time off. And then you do that last chance agreement, where they're, and those are really up to between the employer and employee. How many times are they going to be tested when they come back? What are the consequences of it? So, there's different ways, like you're saying, employers can support those recovery efforts, and help employees stay employed and stay in the workplace. My legal pitch would be make sure you stay consistent, right, with who we're
Mhm.
offering those to and why. and that we're not, it's not being used in a discriminatory manner. But yeah, there's definitely ways to use those and help support employees' recovery in the workplace.
Thanks for saying that, Kristen. I'm going to follow up with, I'm going to have a follow-up question here because we have a few minutes. We have seen a lot of companies move away from pre-employment screening, especially around
Mhm.
cannabis in a state like Colorado, where it really became a barrier to hiring individuals, was anecdotally what we heard. But when you're talking about be clear with the drug screening, because we don't really have a standard impairment test like we do with alcohol, that makes things more complicated, right?
Right.
Because, right, like impairment to someone who was a longtime user may look different and may show up differently on a drug
Mhm.
screen than someone who is a short-term user. So that's a lot of gray area for companies to navigate in my mind,
Mhm.
right? And so is
It
that,
is.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that's where I feel like you've got to have your drug testing policy of when you're going to do it and how. But that's not the whole conversation anymore, right? When I started practicing 20 some years ago, that was the conversation, drug testing, right? And we're done, zero tolerance. Now, to your point of, will we, if we had zero tolerance and we did pre-employment, we're not hiring anybody. Um, Now that's why we're getting to impairment. So I think you've got to pair up some kind of drug testing. What is going to be our plan? And then what is that impairment testing? How are we going to make sure to keep people safe? Is it reasonable suspicion training? Is it going to be that we're going to do some type of game to test any kind of impairment in the morning? Depending on our industry, that may be warranted, right? If we're in a highly safety sensitive industry like construction. So yeah, so I think you've got to pair both now. You can't just stop at drug testing anymore. You've got to get to how we're assessing impairment.
great. Thanks, Kristen. I see some familiar names in the chat. Thank you for bringing that up. I want to remind our listeners and our participants today, the survey for getting continuing education credits is going to come in an email that's coming up later. So you're not going to get that as you leave today. It will come in the follow-up email, and we will make sure you get the link for claiming your CE credits. Greg, Dr. Tong, Dr. Collier, any comments about how workplaces should be considering, cannabis? I know we're new to partner with you all in terms of THC in the workplace, and we're starting to build break room posters and get resources out there. I'm always a fan of just getting people more information and education, which is what I've loved about this conversation. I think a lot of people out there don't understand what the high concentrate products are, so that was really important information. Any other thoughts before we, sort of close out today about where this research goes and how it impacts workplaces specifically?
Yeah, I'll just briefly double down on this issue of impairment really needs additional research, and some of that research around impairment, especially specific to driving, is happening here at CU, including faculty involved with the project. Um, and I'll just say it is a very significant challenge, and maybe I'm just repeating something that's already been said here. And unlike alcohol or some other substance where there's much more clear-cut, easy measurements and more unified impairment levels, the current measures, like blood levels that we have, show wildly different impairment levels with different types of users. It's a it's a it's a tricky problem that the field is trying to better understand and trying to resolve. So
Yeah. Dr. Collier, any comments on that?
Yeah, I don't have that much to add to it except to say that I think we don't have a lot of the social restrictions built into the use of cannabis the same way we do alcohol. And I think that it may lead to kind of more of a casualness about use in the workforce. I mean, I think there's more of a sense of people know you probably shouldn't use alcohol in these circumstances. And I think that I think it doesn't have the same social restrictions. So I'm not really sure. I think that we need to do more research on it. And I think this is an evolving field.
Thank you so much. I'll say, as a trained cultural anthropologist, sociologist by nature, and someone who works with workplaces, if you notice people that are showing up differently, they're sounding differently, they're acting differently, first of all, don't make the assumption that they're on drugs and alcohol. They may be, they may not be, but why not treat them like a friend, a family member, a neighbor, and just ask them how they're doing and if there's any way you can help. And I think the more we can be compassionate and treat human beings like human beings, the better off, the more we'll normalize this conversation. We'll get people the resources and support they need. And that might be one easy takeaway. If someone's showing up differently than they were before, if they're smelling differently, if they're coming into work with a different state of mind, maybe that's an opportunity to just ask them how they're doing and continue to ask them And if and when they're ready to open up, that might be a good point to make sure you have resources. With that being said, I want to really thank Dr. Collier, Dr. Tung, formerly Dr. Bradley, who was on the call, and Kristen White for joining us at today's webinar. It's such an honor and a privilege to be able to do this programming on April 20th. And I know there's so many things going on around 420 in Colorado and around the country, and we're honored to be able to bring this resources and education to you. Our next webinar is in May, Mental Health Awareness Month on May 20th. It's related to this topic, the state of workplace mental health, and we're going to have some terrific speakers with us talking about workplace mental health. You'll be able to register for that webinar when you leave today. So thank you for joining us today. It's been our honor and privilege. You'll get the survey in your email that will be coming, and you can learn more about HealthLinks at any point in time. So thanks again, everybody, for being here today. Thank you to our speakers. We really appreciate it, and stay safe out there, everyone.
Mhm.